Nigel Farage just delivered the most brutal takedown of Keir Starmer ever witnessed in the House of Commons. This wasn't a polite political debate. This wasn't carefully worded criticism. This was an absolute demolition caught live on camera, and Starmer had no answer. The Prime Minister stood there visibly rattled as Farage systematically destroyed every defence, exposed every contradiction and reduced the government's position to rubble. The chamber erupted, the opposition benches were roaring, and Starmer's face told the entire story of a leader who just got publicly humiliated on the national stage. What Farage said in those few minutes is already being called the most devastating PMQs performance in modern political history, and you need to see exactly how he tore Starmer apart piece by piece. The moment Nigel Farage stood up to ask his question, you could feel the tension in the chamber shift. This wasn't going to be a routine exchange. Farage had that look that barely contained energy of someone who knows they're holding a political grenade and is about to pull the pin. He started calmly, almost conversationally, laying out the facts of the government's latest policy disaster. But with every sentence, the intensity built. He wasn't asking for clarification or expressing concern. He was building a prosecutorial case against the Prime Minister, and everyone in that chamber knew where this was heading. The government benches went quiet. The opposition benches leaned forward, and Starmer's expression shifted from confident to concerned in real time. Farage's opening gambit was devastating in its simplicity. He cited Starmer's own words from previous speeches, promises made during the campaign, commitments given to the British people. Then, with surgical precision, he contrasted those promises with the reality of what the government has actually delivered. The gap between promise and performance wasn't just wide, it was a chasm. And Farage made sure every single person watching understood just how completely Starmer had failed to deliver on his commitments. He used the Prime Minister's own rhetoric as a weapon against him, and there's no defence against that kind of attack. You can't argue with your own recorded statements. But Farage wasn't satisfied with just pointing out broken promises. He went deeper, questioning the fundamental competence of Starmer's administration. He brought up recent scandals, policy failures, and administrative disasters that have plagued the government. Each example was carefully chosen for maximum impact, the kind of failures that ordinary voters understand and care about. He wasn't getting lost in Westminster procedural details or obscure policy minutiae. He was talking about real consequences for real people, and he was holding Starmer personally responsible for every single failure. The attack was relentless, building momentum with each new accusation. The chamber's reaction was electric. As Farage delivered each hammer blow, the opposition benches erupted in cheers and jeers directed at the Prime Minister. Conservative MPs were shouting agreement. Reform UK members were on their feet. Even some of the minor parties were visibly enjoying Starmer's discomfort. The noise level was extraordinary, forcing the Speaker to repeatedly call for order, but the interventions only amplified the sense that Farage had struck a nerve. This wasn't manufactured outrage or political theatre. This was genuine parliamentary fury directed at a Prime Minister who was losing control of the narrative. Starmer's body language during this assault was absolutely fascinating. He started off trying to look dismissive, doing that thing politicians do where they shake their heads and smile like the criticism is beneath contempt. But as Farage continued, as the examples piled up and the contradictions became impossible to ignore, that facade cracked. Starmer started shuffling his notes, clearly looking for the prepared response that would counter this attack. His advisors were frantically passing him papers. The ministers around him were avoiding eye contact, nobody wanting to be associated with the incoming train wreck. And when Farage finally sat down, having delivered what can only be described as a political evisceration, the Prime Minister stood up to respond, looking like a man who knew he was in serious trouble. Starmer's response was worse than anyone could have predicted. He tried to bat away Farage's points with generic talking points about the government's achievements and the opposition's lack of credible alternatives. It was the kind of weak defensive response that makes a bad situation catastrophic. He didn't address the specific contradictions Farage had highlighted. He didn't explain how his promises aligned with his performance. He just fell back on party line platitudes that convinced nobody and satisfied no one. The opposition benches absolutely savaged him, the jeering and laughter drowning out parts of his response. And through it all, Farage sat there with a knowing smile, watching Starmer dig himself deeper. What made this exchange particularly brutal was how it played to Farage's strengths and Starmer's weaknesses. Farage is a political street fighter, someone who's spent decades mastering the art of the devastating soundbite and the killer question. He doesn't do nuance or careful political positioning, he goes for the throat. Starmer, by contrast, is a lawyer by training, someone used to careful arguments and procedural precision. That works fine when you're in a controlled environment, but in the bear pit of PMQs, facing someone like Farage, who doesn't care about political niceties, it's a liability. Starmer tried to out-lawyer Farage, and instead he got demolished by someone playing a completely different game. The media reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Within minutes, clips of Farage's question and Starmer's weak response were circulating on social media. Political commentators were calling it one of the most one-sided exchanges in PMQ's history. Even journalists who usually defend the government were struggling to spin this as anything other than a complete humiliation. The headlines started writing themselves. Starmer destroyed. Farage triumphs, government in crisis. And every replay of the exchange, every analysis of Starmer's stumbling response just reinforced how badly the Prime Minister had been beaten. What's particularly damaging about this PMQ's humiliation is that it's not an isolated incident. It's the culmination of weeks of mounting pressure on Starmer's government, and Farage tapped into all of that accumulated frustration in one devastating intervention. The public has been watching this government struggle with crisis after crisis. They've seen the policy reversals, the broken promises, the administrative incompetence, and now they've seen the Prime Minister get absolutely dismantled by Nigel Farage in front of the entire nation. That's the kind of moment that shifts political narratives, that changes how voters perceive their leaders, that creates lasting damage to a government's credibility. The specific issues Farage raised during his intervention are worth examining because they reveal just how thoroughly he'd prepared for this moment. He didn't just throw random accusations at Starmer. He built a structured argument that moved from general failures to specific examples to personal accountability. He talked about economic promises that haven't materialised, showing how ordinary families are worse off now than when Labour took power. He highlighted immigration policies that have completely failed to deliver the control the government promised. He pointed to public services that are in worse shape despite increased spending. Each point was backed by specific data, recent news stories, or Starmer's own contradictory statements. The immigration portion of Farage's attack was particularly devastating because it's terrain where he's always been strongest and where Starmer is most vulnerable. Farage hammered the government on the gap between their tough rhetoric on border control and the actual numbers of illegal crossings, which haven't decreased despite all the promises. He quoted Starmer's campaign speeches about getting tough on immigration, then contrasted them with the reality of record arrivals and a system that's clearly not working. And he did it all in language that connects with voters who feel lied to about this issue. The government benches had no response because there is no good response when the facts are that damaging. On economic policy, Farage was equally brutal. He cited specific tax increases that Starmer promised wouldn't happen during the campaign, but that have been implemented anyway. He talked about business confidence collapsing, investment decisions being postponed, and economic growth stalling. He asked how the Prime Minister could justify breaking explicit tax promises to working families while presiding over an economy that's going nowhere. And he framed it not as technical economic policy, but as a question of basic honesty and competence. Can you trust a Prime Minister who breaks fundamental promises? Can you trust a government that can't manage the economy? Those questions hang in the air unanswered and damaging. The visual contrast between Farage and Starmer during this exchange was striking and symbolic. Farage was animated, energised, clearly enjoying every moment of this confrontation. He spoke without notes for much of his intervention, showing he knew his material cold and didn't need to rely on prepared scripts. His delivery was confident, almost conversational, like he was just explaining obvious truths to people who should already know them. Starmer, meanwhile, was hunched over his dispatch box, clutching his notes, speaking in that monotone lawyer voice that makes everything sound like a legal briefing rather than a political argument. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Energy versus exhaustion, confidence versus defensiveness, attack versus retreat. The parliamentary theatre of it all was extraordinary. The House of Commons can be a brutal environment, but it's usually controlled brutality with clear rules and expectations. What Farage did was push right up to the edge of those rules without crossing them. He was scathing without being unparliamentary. He was devastating without using language that would get him called out by the Speaker. It was a master class in how to destroy an opponent within the constraints of parliamentary procedure, and the fact that he did it so effectively, staying just inside the lines while absolutely eviscerating Starmer, made it even more impressive and more damaging. The aftermath in the chamber was almost as interesting as the exchange itself. After Starmer sat down from his weak response, you could see Labour MPs looking deflated and concerned. They knew what had just happened. They knew their leader had been beaten, and badly. Some were trying to rally, shouting support and attacking Farage, but it felt hollow and desperate. The opposition benches, meanwhile, were absolutely delighted. Conservative MPs were slapping Farage on the back. Reform UK members were celebrating like they'd just won an election. The energy in the room had completely shifted and everyone knew it. Social media exploded in the minutes following the exchange. The clip of Farage's question went viral immediately, racking up millions of views within the first hour. The hashtags were brutal, Starmer destroyed, Farage wins, PMQs humiliation. Political activists on both sides were sharing their takes, but even Labour supporters were struggling to defend Starmer's performance. Some were trying to argue that Farage's points were exaggerated or taken out of context, but when people could watch the full exchange themselves, those defences fell flat. The video evidence was too clear, too damning, too obviously one-sided. The broader political implications of this PMQS destruction extend far beyond one bad day for the Prime Minister. Farage has been positioning himself and Reform UK as the real opposition to Labour, arguing that the Conservatives are too weak and compromised to effectively challenge the government. This performance gives that argument serious credibility. If Farage can do this to Starmer in a single PMQS intervention, imagine what he could do with more parliamentary presence and more opportunities to hold the government to account. That's the message he's sending to voters who are frustrated with Labour but don't see the Conservatives as a viable alternative. For Starmer personally, this is a crisis of authority and credibility. Prime Ministers are supposed to dominate PMQs. It's their chance to show command of the issues, rhetorical skill and political strength. When a PM gets beaten at PMQs, especially this badly, it raises questions about their fitness for the role. If you can't handle Nigel Farage asking tough questions, how can you handle running the country? If you can't defend your own record and your own promises, what does that say about your leadership? These are the questions that will now dog Starmer, and they don't have easy answers. The government's response strategy in the hours after this humiliation has been telling. Rather than trying to address the substance of Farage's criticisms, they've largely tried to attack Farage himself. They're questioning his motives, his record, his party's policies. It's classic deflection, and it's a sign that they don't have good answers to the actual points raised. When you can't defend your record, you attack your accuser. When you can't justify your broken promises, you try to change the subject. The public sees through this strategy, and it just makes the government look even weaker. The media coverage has been absolutely relentless. Every major outlet is running the story, many with headlines that are devastating for Starmer. Television news has played the clip repeatedly, often in slow motion, to capture Starmer's facial expressions as Farage demolished him. Political analysts are dissecting every word, every gesture, every moment of the exchange. And the consensus is nearly unanimous. Farage won decisively, Starmer lost badly. And this is a significant political moment that will have lasting consequences. Inside the Labour Party, there are reports of serious concern about Starmer's performance. Backbench MPs are worried about how this plays in their constituencies. They're hearing from voters who watched the exchange and are questioning whether Starmer is up to the job. Some MPs are privately expressing frustration that the leadership didn't prepare better for what was obviously going to be a hostile intervention from Farage. Others are questioning the broader strategy of trying to ignore or downplay legitimate criticisms rather than addressing them head on. The internal party dynamics are shifting, and not in Starmer's favour. The opposition parties are naturally trying to capitalise on this moment. The Conservatives are arguing that if Farage can expose Labour's failures this effectively, imagine what a Conservative government could do. Reform UK is using this as a recruitment tool, pointing to Farage's performance as evidence that they're the real opposition and encouraging supporters to join them. Smaller parties are piling on with their own criticism, sensing weakness and trying to grab some attention. The political feeding frenzy is intense and it's all centred on Starmer's failure. What makes this particularly damaging is that it's not just a bad news cycle that will fade in a few days. This is video evidence of the Prime Minister being comprehensively beaten in parliamentary combat. It's the kind of clip that will be replayed in future election campaigns, used in opposition advertisements, and referenced every time someone questions Starmer's effectiveness as a leader. It's permanent record of a humiliating defeat, and in modern politics, nothing ever really goes away. This moment will haunt Starmer for the rest of his time in office. The public reaction has been mixed but largely negative for Starmer. Polls conducted immediately after the exchange show a significant number of voters saying it changed their opinion of the Prime Minister, and not in a good way. People who were already sceptical of Starmer feel vindicated. People who gave him the benefit of the doubt are now having second thoughts. Even some Labour supporters are expressing disappointment, wishing their leader had fought back more effectively or had better answers to legitimate questions. The political damage is real and measurable. Looking at the strategic implications of this PMQs humiliation, it's clear that Farage has significantly raised his profile and his party's standing at Starmer's expense. Before this exchange, Reform UK was a presence in Parliament, but not necessarily a dominant force in national political debate. After this performance, Farage has positioned himself as a major player, someone who can go toe-to-toe with the Prime Minister and come out on top. That's invaluable for building political momentum and attracting media attention. Every journalist will now want to hear Farage's take on government failures, knowing he can deliver quotable, devastating criticisms. For the government's legislative agenda, this kind of humiliation creates serious problems. When a Prime Minister looks weak, it emboldens opponents and makes it harder to marshal support for controversial policies. MPs who are on the fence about supporting government initiatives will be less inclined to stick their necks out for a leader who's taking political damage. The opposition will smell blood and fight harder against everything the government tries to do. The entire political dynamic shifts when the Prime Minister is perceived as vulnerable, and Starmer is definitely vulnerable right now. The timing of this humiliation couldn't be worse for Starmer. The government is already dealing with multiple crises, policy failures and declining poll numbers. They didn't need another self-inflicted wound, but that's exactly what this is. Starmer's inability to effectively respond to Farage's attack is a self-inflicted injury that will require significant damage control. The question is whether the government can recover from this or whether it's the beginning of a downward spiral. History shows that prime ministers who start looking weak often find it very difficult to recover that aura of strength and authority.